Hi, everyone. Welcome to Psychotherapy Networker. My name is Anna Locke. I am the clinical director for Networker, and I am very pleased to be here today with Leslie Priscilla. We are going to be talking about her work with Latinx Parenting. I want to give a quick sort of intro to Leslie before we start chatting. So Leslie does coaching, workshops, support, and advocacy for the Latinx families and as well as professionals and trainings working both nationally and internationally with with the organization Latinx Parenting. She is the founder of this organization, and it's dedicated in her passions of children's rights and social and racial justice. And they're doing some really exciting things in supporting the Latinx culture. Community. And I am looking forward to chatting with her today. As we start chatting, I always like to see where folks are joining us from. So go ahead and um, uh, and give your hometown where you're joining us from a shout out in the chat. Um, Hi, Leslie.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm in like full World Cup mode, and Mexico played this morning and we won, but we're not advancing. And anyway, it's like it's a thing that I've just been really into. It's like a cultural pride thing. So I'm sure we'll talk about that throughout
Yes.
the conversation. Yeah, but I'm just very happy and grateful to be here.
Yes, of course. Um, so what I would love to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing, and I'm curious just sort of what led you to founding the Latinx Parenting organization and to kind of pursuing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I always say that like my first parenting experience was actually being an older sister to my little sister who was born 10 years after I was born. And during the time that she was born, I went through a very tumultuous, very chaotic time in my nuclear family with my parents. They were separating at the time, and I wanted her to be safe, protected, emotionally connected to at least me, right? And so after founding Latinx Parenting, I kind of reflected back on that experience, and I was like, I think that was the first time that I was like, I want something different for this child than I experienced. And I mean, I was just 10 years old, so I wasn't even thinking, that this was emotional intelligence or attachment or any of these things. And when I think it was like the first few years of college. I like went into psychology and eventually took a child development course. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could have so much um, ability, power to really change the life of a child by working with children. So I started working with children. I was a preschool teacher for many years, did my, entire master teacher certification, and had my own classroom for quite a long time. And I started noticing that kids would come into my classroom with behavioral problems, very disconnected, not really, ready to kind of receive some of the things that I wanted to share with them. And I started quickly realizing that, my connection to them was really what was supportive. But then they would go home, right? Then they would go back for Christmas break or for spring break, and then they would come back into the classroom. And I had done all this work, and then it felt like all of that work was undone when they would come back. And I was like, okay, something is going on at home, and I really want to start finding out what that is so that we can kind of address it at a deeper root, right? And so that's, I think, what opened me up to wanting to work with parents. And so during that time also, I became pregnant with my first child, and working with children is very different than having your own child. I think anybody out there who has worked with children and then has their own children would probably agree with that.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't just send these kids home. I couldn't send my child home to anybody. I was that home. And so I realized, that parenting is actually extremely, extremely difficult. And but I was really committed. I was really committed to giving my child something different than I had grown up with, and at the same time wanting to ensure that my culture was preserved, that my culture was sustained. All of the parenting books that I started reading were written by white parenting authors, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just didn't see my culture really reflected in that. And so when I started working with parents at an agency after I received my certification as a parent educator through Ruth Beaglehole, who is an incredible woman. If you don't know who Ruth Eaglehole is, she's just like really been in this work for, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades. And, I started working with parents and just realizing that we, as a culture, Latinx parents, Latina, Latino, Latina, however you want to identify, we were really ready to heal a lot of the patterns that we had grown up with. I had experienced it personally. I began to hear a lot of stories from these families about the cycles that they were trying to break. And it felt amazing to be able to work with families that were very much like my family, right? I might not have been able to make that impact with my own family, but making that impact with families that identified in similar ways really opened up the door for me to begin looking for something that addressed the needs of the Latinx community specifically, and I didn't find anything. Um, I didn't find any books that really talked about, our experiences and the history and a lot of the layers that I think that we have to grapple with, that maybe other communities don't necessarily have to grapple with in the same way. And so when I couldn't find anything like that in 2018, I was like, well, I guess I have to start it. And I guess I have to begin to really embody, the vision that I hold for Latinx families specifically. And so that's kind of what led into the creation of Latinx Parenting. I was very hesitant at first because I was like, I don't know if the community is really ready for me to start talking about nonviolence, brain development, all of these things. I'm going to receive a lot of pushback. And there has been pushback, but it's been overwhelmingly a really positive and really beautiful response, with people, sharing that they are grateful that this exists. I'm very rewarded, I think, by being able to continue this work and to be in spaces with Latinx families who are breaking generational cycles of trauma and abuse.
That's powerful and wonderful. I think anytime we're able to face our own challenges and then recognize how we can use our skill sets and our education to impact more, and to make a difference, I think is so difficult and so awesome. Something that I'm really curious about in the work that you're doing, and something that I think as therapists we strive to be more aware of, is that there are these sort of themes in cultures that might be impacting our clients. So being aware of the sort of larger cultural possibilities, but then also being aware that that wouldn't necessarily apply to every person, and getting individual experiences as well. What are the sort of bigger themes in families that you were picking up on?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones is just understanding how a lot of the parenting behaviors manifest from an intention to preserve values, right? Very specific cultural values. The biggest ones, I think, being respeto, which is respect, and familismo being familism, or just, our expression of collectivism. And so where we were trying to teach respect, and feminismo in these ways that felt pretty authoritarian. I think, we have this, it's a joke in Latinx pop culture, but it's not really a joke, of parents who use la chancla, right? Which is like a sandal to correct children's behavior. And so you'll see this on TikTok, you'll see it on Instagram, all these videos of mostly Latina moms using a chancla to correct behavior. And I used to laugh at those because that was honestly one of the first times that I ever saw represented a Latinx family, right? And I was like, oh, this is totally relatable. This is totally, what I grew up with. And so I did have that sense of belonging. I did have that sense of connection to it. And the more I learned, the more I realized that there were serious implications to perpetuating the normalization of that kind of parenting behavior. And that's actually also a huge stereotype that is not as common anymore with Latinx families, myself, for example, and many other families who have really shed those kinds of parenting dynamics. And so now we realize that respect and collectivism can be taught in ways that honor the child, that are more rooted in connection, that are more rooted in an intention to heal in personal ways as well, individual ways as well. But I think the biggest theme that I have found is that whenever there is that kind of challenge, strategy around trying to get kids to behave, it's rooted in the intention to preserve that value. And that value is so important for, and has historically been so important for us, for our survival as a community. And so my goal, right, is to ensure that parents move away from these survival strategies and more towards healing and thriving and gentleness and self-compassion and self-empathy, right? So my intention is never to shame parents away from wanting to preserve those cultural values. It's just the how, right? And so one example I'll give sometimes when it comes to respect is, when you are, this is a very common experience in Latinx families, when you are in a social setting with your family members, you have to kiss everybody on the cheek, right? You have to go and you have to, like, every single person, regardless of whether or not you know them, regardless of whether or not you're comfortable with it. And I remember being that child too and being like, this is weird. I don't know this person, but this is how you show respect, right, to your elders. You kiss them on the cheek. The value of respect inherently is a good value to teach and to share. And also we want to ensure that children have the right to their bodies, right? The right to their comfort, the right to their autonomy and how they greet people. And so again, it's about, how do we continue to teach these values? How do we sustain our cultural values without negating the fact that children have rights, right? And so
Yes.
one of the things that my teacher Ruth taught me at the very beginning of the training, and I'll never forget this, and I say this, I've said this probably millions of times to millions of people, probably not millions, but anyway, she said, this is actually not about parenting. She said, this is about children's rights. She said, this is about social justice for children. And this is about ensuring that children are seen as human beings and not dehumanized by our parental behaviors of who they should be or how they need to be fixed or how they need to, bend to our will, right? And so we have to be very aware of that, I think, as Latinx individuals, and also not separate the fact that this is historical, right? Like, we have, as a culture, experienced marginalization, oppression, abuse of authority for 500 years, right? Since colonization began on this land. And so my goal has been to really understand the ways that those systemic historical traumas have impacted our parenting in everyday moments, right? In our everyday life to this day. And once we can recognize that, I think as parents, it allows us to experience that gentleness for our experience, right? That compassion for our experience, because we really are trying to undo and unlearn things that maybe, were not a part of our family historically or pre-colonization, right? But came in as an adaptation to other oppressive forces, right? And so whenever I hear somebody defending La Chancla, for example, and saying, this is just our culture, this is just who we are, this is just, our community, I really challenge that, because there are things that we have done in our families to adapt to those systemic forces, to those historical factors that are not necessarily our culture, but are adaptations to what we've experienced.
That is such powerful work. And I want to just take it 1 second for those who might just be joining us to kind of orient what we're talking about. We're speaking to Leslie. Leslie, I did not clarify how to pronounce your last name, and I might have butchered it. So I wanted to come back and have you pronounce it for me.
Yeah, I'm just Leslie Priscilla.
Priscilla. Okay, gotcha. All right. So we're speaking with Leslie Priscilla, founder of Latinx Parenting. She's sharing with us the work that she's doing to support social and racial justice within the Latinx community, helping to change the narrative around parenting and supporting children within Latinx families. She also does training for professionals. You'll see on the screen here that she has kindly shared a discount on her trainings with you, promo code networker. And the address is on the screen where you can put in that promo code and get a discount to learn more about this work. Leslie, I hear how you are using this experience and this knowledge to change the narrative with individuals and with families. What suggestions, what guidance do you have for therapists who might be sitting with a client who is either growing up and coming out of those experiences, and maybe like parents that are working to try to change that experience, and make different choices? What might therapists do to best support that process?
Yeah, there's actually, and this professionals intensive that I hold a couple times a year, we really kind of dive into this, and we get a chance to contextualize the information with actual experiences from clinicians that they've had in the therapy room or in, organizations. And I think one of the greatest things that we can do is to constantly check our biases, our assumptions, the stereotypes that we've internalized about Latinx families. We do an activity in this training where we list out all of the stereotypes. We list out everything that we've ever heard about the ways that Latina mothers, Latino fathers, Latinx children, and families in general, all of the stereotypes that revolve around the Latinx family. And so when we look at it, it's dozens of stereotypes, right? And so we unknowingly, unconsciously, a lot of times, especially I think people who are not Latinx, have internalized these ideas of the ways that Latinx families are.
Mm-hmm.
And, in your training in school, you are told to check those assumptions. You're told to check your biases. You're told to, understand how your power holding impacts families as well. And I think that is something that we need reminders of, right? Like, I think especially post-pandemic, like we're a completely different community now. We're a completely different culture. Like, we have been we're ongoingly, I don't know if ongoingly is a word, but there's been this ongoing impact on us as Latinx families that I think clinicians really need to stay up on. And to constantly be challenging their own assumptions about us, right? Oh, well, and I've heard this before. We're like, oh, they're Latino families, so you know what that's like. And I'm just like, no, what do you mean by that, right? And I think that those of us who are, and myself included, even as a Latina, those of us who are in privilege holding positions, right? And my position as a parenting coach is a privileged position. I'm coming in as an authority. I'm coming in as somebody who holds information. That is something of privilege, right? And so I have to be very attuned to what this family is trying to teach me, just as much as I'm trying to share information with this family, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that requires a deep humility. I think that requires a paradigm shift internally in us as power holders. And I think that we, as we approach families who are going through really big transitions or really big, events in their lives, or even seemingly minor events in their lives, those minor events can feel really big because a lot of our families have not had the privilege, the space, the resources, concrete resources, right? Access to therapy, things like that, to be able to process, right? To be able to really feel into a lot of the grief that needs to be felt, to be able to recognize what their strengths already are, to be able to look at all of their assets, right? And to amplify those. And so I think we as power holders, whether we're clinicians or parent coaches, our job is to be as objective as possible, to not make any assumptions, and to really show up with an open heart, right? I talk about the differences in this training. We talk about the differences between being a trauma-informed practitioner or clinician, and being a healing-centered one, right? And so for me, the healing-centered framework centers not only the individual and the event and, whatever individualized trauma they may have experienced, but it really centers culture. It really centers reconnection back to their community, right? And I think that there's been this like big wave of cultural competency training, and I think that that's wonderful. But we also have to realize that competency can be weaponized against our families. And the way that that happens is you have an understanding of, who these families might be, just at a wide level.
Mhm.
But it causes us sometimes to not really look at this family as an individual or this person as an individual. Um, and we don't really know anything really except what they are gifting us in terms of, their story
Mhm.
and their process. And so again, I think it just goes back to humility,
Mhm.
and the intention to be sustaining in ways that we can be sustaining. And yeah, I feel very privileged anytime I hear. I just recently wrapped up a series that I was doing with a group of recently immigrated mothers. And I mean, I feel like I might have learned more than they did, just because of the stories that they told me, and their experiences. And so I think that when we approach it in that way, and we're not approaching it as a hierarchical, I'm going to be supporting you in this way, but rather like we're forming a relationship, we're forming a connection. My intention is to attune to your need and not assume what your need is.
Mhm. That, can you repeat that phrase again? That felt really important.
Yeah, I think the intention is to attune to what
Mhm.
the need is and not assume what the need is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, that does feel very important on so many levels for our profession.
Yeah.
Um, one last question with regards to the work that you're doing. I really like what you said a few minutes back about helping Latinx individuals to find other ways of connecting with those valued aspects of their family and community. So respect was one example. Um, uh, and I think that that's really helpful to hear as a way of, let's keep that value. Let's not try to assimilate. Let's not try to change. And let's find other ways to live in line with it. I think one of my worries always as a white therapist is, am I trying to like put my cultural expectations, my family expectations on the person in front of me by recommending this change, by recommending. So that idea of finding other ways to live in line with the value feels really, really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're projecting all the time. It's just human nature, right? So, I've been able to be very transparent with families and say, this is and I think that, I'm fortunate in some ways because, I'm not a clinician, right? Like I work with clinicians, I train clinicians. I am not a clinician, but I've had very intensive experiences in this community, not only having grown up in it, but working with families and, at one point teaching 7 parenting classes a week and just being really in it. And so one of the things that, I've realized is that I can be really transparent about my story,
Mhm.
and let people know this is my experience, right? This is how I have experienced moving through this situation. And also, I think that I find so much power in returning to the collectivism by facilitating groups because they are able to support, like the Latinx community. We know inherently, I think, so many communities, but I think my observation is that we inherently know how to hold space, right? We inherently know how to be in community because we are such a collectivist culture. And so sometimes I kind of just sit back and I let them hold space for one another, and so somebody will share something and I will ask somebody else who can resonate to share their experience. And so you see this like beautiful tapestry kind of being woven of their stories, and I might be able to add in a couple threads of my story here as well, right? And so by the end of this group we have this like really colorful piece of conversation and insights, and we also allow a lot of space for processing and silence, right? And so whenever there's a question being posed, I'm not asking them to be quick to answer it. I just want the reflection, right? I just want to be able to use this space as a point of reflection. Like, let me share this little bit of my story with you, and let's just sit with it for a little bit.
Yeah.
And when you're ready, we can see what comes up for you. And so, yeah, I think that, so many of us have, as children, been told that our stories are not something that matters very much, right? Or our experiences um, don't matter as much as adult experiences. And I think a lot of us have internalized that. And so showing up in spaces where you can be vulnerable is, I think, to me, very sacred. And I tell them, I'm like, this is not a true, you'll hear safe space. This is a safe space. This is like everything's safe here. It's actually not. Everything is not, every space is going to be a safe space, because there's always the capacity that somebody is going to feel hurt or harmed by something that somebody says. But what there are brave spaces, right? There's vulnerable spaces. There's spaces that we can just show up authentically and assume that there will be a holding of that. And so, I think that's I think what I love the most about working with the Latinx community is that, like, there's a remembering of, our ability to not only support but also be supported. And it's not just me as the power holder holding all of the space, right? I'm distributing it. I'm sharing with them that power. And in that, I'm also modeling what that looks like in their parenting relationship with their children.
That's so helpful to hear. And I hear that shift in how we as therapists can support both individuals and communities, that it can be more like, considering groups, considering like more sort of open communication spaces versus sort of the one-on-one, like expert, patient kind of dynamic. Leslie, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your work with us. I do want to just sort of review really quickly. So again, professional intensives coming up. Please use the promo code Networker for an exclusive discount. You also, in addition to doing trainings for professionals, you do parenting trainings as well. And you, are both the parent training and the professional trainings offered bilingually?
Yes.
Okay.
So the professionals intensive training, we are preparing the Spanish version of that. It's not ready yet. So this next one that's coming up in March, and then next September will probably be offered only in English. However, all of the parenting classes are available in Spanish, whether you're buying the pre-recorded ones or whether you're hiring us to come in and run a workshop. I am bilingual, and so I will facilitate in whatever language, well, not whatever language, but either English or Spanish.
Yeah.
And I love that the pandemic kind of opened up the fact that we can reach each other in this way, and that, and we have our own translators or interpreters as well that we can bring in. And so accessibility is a big priority for us, and so we really want to get this information out to parents, to families, to former, what we call former children as well, right? So I do a lot of the inner child work. I've been practicing it for, over a decade. And so I share that experience with parents as well. We consider the two legs of Latinx parenting being the inner child work, the reparenting work, and the parenting work. And so they go together. And obviously working with professionals is amazing too, because we get to work through, like I said, a lot of the situations that come up on a daily basis for us in working with Latinx families.
Well, I'm so grateful to you for the work that you're doing. I'm going to be signing up for this intensive. And last but not least, before we wrap up, as a thank you to all of you for attending today, we are offering an exclusive discount on our Psychotherapy Networker magazine. The website psychotherapynetworker.org/magsub, MAGSUB. The magazine is really a place where we explore these interesting and difficult conversations about being therapists and how we do the work that we do, as challenging as it is. So please check us out. Leslie, thank you again. It's been wonderful chatting with you.
Thank you, Anna. I'll talk to you soon.